Hey guys, it's Zach with Splitwood Studio. For a little while now, I have been wanting something that I have built in our house. And generally, when I build things, I build them for customers and they just immediately go out to them. So I have one or two small things, but I really wanted more of a centerpiece. Well, in the middle of trying to figure out what I wanted to build, I came across this video by Oliver Gomez, and it really inspired me to try and build something without epoxy. You see epoxy everywhere, over YouTube especially, and I'm not against epoxy, I just think that there is a little bit more talent when epoxy is not involved. And to be clear, there is some epoxy in this build, but it is just for filling voids, which I really like the look of knot holes filled with black epoxy in almost any wood. So far what you've seen me do is mostly just flattening this slab that I'm going to be using. Now this is a Cottonwood slab that I got from Utah Tree Cycle. They're a great company to work with. Highly recommend them if you live in Utah. One of the big lessons that I seem to keep forgetting is before I thickness something, whether that be on the router sled or through the planer, I really need to know exactly what I'm going to be doing with it. Essentially, every time you thickness something, you want to have the board closest to the final size that you can. Now, generally, you want to have an inch or two to spare at least. But with this one, I thicknessed it and then I realized that I could cut it in half. But if I had done that before I put it through the router sled, I could have saved about 1/8 of an inch, which isn't a ton, but I have to send this through the router sled several times, and so that could have saved me in the long run. Once I got everything through the milling process, I went ahead and started filling voids. And the way I like to do this is putting a hot glue bead around a void. That way it creates essentially a dam that I can overfill so that as the epoxy seeps in, it is pulling from that dam. And I'm proud to be partnering up with Ultra Clear Epoxy. If you're ever going to be using any epoxy, or if you just want to try out a different company, then use code ULTRA20 at checkout to save 20%. After pouring the second of 3 batches of epoxy, I moved on to cutting, I'll call them the splines. They'll essentially have the same job as those popsicle sticks in Oliver's video. Now, I wanted to make mine out of some walnut as some really good contrast. Most of this was pretty oversized because I got it from a cabinet shop. And if you don't know, you can almost always go to a cabinet shop and buy their scraps, or sometimes they'll just give them to you for free. While the third batch of epoxy was curing, I went ahead and decided that it was time to start building a jig for the next step. Despite having been woodworking for several years now, I don't have a good crosscut sled. And so for the next step, I figured that a crosscut sled would help a lot. Mostly because my miter saw is pretty small, it doesn't have the capacity to be able to cut these slabs the way I needed to cut them. I didn't spend a whole ton of time on this because I knew that eventually I want to upgrade my table saw to a larger unit. And so I really just focused on making sure that the back stop was perfectly 90 with the saw blade. And I didn't record it, but essentially I just screwed down one corner of the back 2x4, made my initial cut through the melamine, and then used a square to get this back 2x4 in the right position, clamped it, and then I sent a couple more screws into it. Once all was said and done, I got to take it for its maiden voyage, and I was extremely surprised at how good this worked. I am a little bit disappointed that I did not do this earlier in my woodworking career, just because it seriously had a lot better effect than using the chop saw. I've already used it for several other projects as well, including miters and splines, and it has worked flawlessly each time. And to be clear, I'm not saying that chop saws are bad. It's more that my chop saw is a pretty cheap one, and so it doesn't give me super repeatable cuts. After that, I moved on to how I was going to glue everything together, and I figured since I have the domino, that's probably the best bet. There are 100% other ways I could have gone that would have been, I'd say, just about as good. Biggest thing is that they wouldn't be as fast. And that's really where the domino outshines any of its competition, is you can lay out all the lines and that'll take the same amount of time no matter what you're using. But say I was going to use a doweling jig, most of the ones I've seen, you have to clamp them on, screw the hole, unclamp it, move it to the next spot. Whereas the domino, you just hold it there, and then it also comes with these pieces you saw me just taking off that allow you to have the same offset every single time from that first hole. For the average hobbyist, I would say it's not worth it. To go buy a different jig or a biscuit, anything really would be better than paying $1,300 for this. But if you're planning on going into furniture making, then this is pretty vital to speed up that process while still getting a very strong joint. Now this project took a ton of dominoes. I could not imagine trying to do this with dowels or any other jig, but I'd love to hear how many you think it took. I'll leave a comment or something at the end of the video saying how many it actually took, but I just want to hear what you think. As for layout on the dominoes, all of them going through the walnut I kept on the tight setting, and on the cottonwood, the ones closest to the edge I kept on the tight setting, but the ones closer to the middle, that live edge side, I put on the wide setting, and that will allow for expansion and contraction of the wood, but will essentially force it to be on the inner side of the table rather than on the border. To make sure that none of the parts that would expand or contract would end up showing unfinished parts of the wood, I prepped everything before gluing it up, including the live edge and all of the sections of walnut that would be seen, plus about an inch. The cottonwood shouldn't expand or contract that much, but I just wanted to be safe while also having plenty of glue surface. For all of these areas that I prepped before, I used Tung oil. And to be honest, the biggest reason that I did this was just because that's what I had on hand. Additionally, I had spent pretty much the whole budget on the wood, and so I wasn't able to go and buy additional finish until later. I'm definitely not a big fan of it, especially after this project. I found that it generally can leave a lot of sticky residue. For small parts like this, it works pretty okay because it's a lot easier to wipe them off so that it doesn't have that sticky residue. But for larger projects or larger surfaces, I haven't had a good success with it yet. To make sure that all of these surfaces would be pretty good at repelling water, as that's the biggest thing that I could see these facing, I did 2 coats, sanding between coats. And to be honest, that's going to add a whole ton of protection because these parts are all going to be facing vertical or nearly vertical. And so it doesn't need to protect from, say, standing water. Once the second coat had long enough to cure, I moved on to the most stressful part for any woodworker, and that's the glue up. And to be honest, the glue up wasn't super bad, it was just kind of tedious. I show here gluing up what I'll call one segment. To do so, what I have to do is put glue on the cottonwood strips that are down below, then put it on the walnut spline, throw in the dominoes, put more glue on the other side of the walnut spline, and then do the same thing on the cottonwood slab parts that are going to go on top of that spline. And I have to do a pretty good amount of glue because this is an end grain to long grain joint to make sure that it's as strong as possible, and because the cottonwood is going to soak up a lot of that glue, I put in a lot of it. And I had to repeat this about 20 times to be able to get the length that I wanted for this coffee table. And really, this is where those dominoes are going to come in handy, is they will give a pretty good amount of structural reinforcement, but generally the reason I use them is for alignment. For each joint like this, if there weren't a domino, if you imagine it slipping just a 64th of an inch, which really isn't much when it comes to a glue up. Now if they all slipped the same direction, that could add up to about 2/3 of an inch over the course of this whole top. To make this glue up a little bit easier, I split it up into 3 parts. Once those 3 parts had dried separately, I could then come back and glue them together, and I really only had to worry about 2 joints at that point. However, the issue that I came across is that those clamps that I used, since I didn't have one that was long enough, ended up putting a fairly significant bow into the workpiece, and so I had to throw it back onto the router sled to get rid of that. In the long run, I like how the table turned out, but it was a really good reminder to be very diligent about glue ups, especially when there are about 40 joints that you need to be watching out for. And it really would have been a pretty simple fix. All I would have needed to do was clamp down the corners to the table. I would rather come back and change the thickness because I want to, rather than because I need to. Once I got done sending it through the router sled, I decided that I didn't like how the edges all looked, and so I decided I was going to break another rule of woodworking, and that's to put a frame around solid wood. Biggest reason is for expansion and contraction. Because at this point in the build I didn't have a real jointer, I just had a benchtop one that wasn't long enough to get this stock truly flat, I decided I'd just throw it on the router sled, and that worked like a charm. Really the only issue I had with it is that it leaves the chatter marks, but I was able to come back and clean that up with the planer, and so it wasn't that big of an issue. For the smaller parts, I went ahead and jointed the second face using the jointer, whereas the larger parts I jointed the second face using the planer with a planer sled. Then I brought it all over to the table saw and cut it to its final width. Before I could cut the miters in the frame, I needed to make sure that the table was going to be its final width and length. To do that, I just used the track saw with the square, and that worked perfect. Looking back on cutting the miters, I really wish that I had thought of using the table saw, as I've never been able to dial in my chop saw to how accurate it really should be for a project like this. Whereas, since building this table, I have built several breadbox style boxes or jewelry boxes that all have miters or similar angles, and I feel like I've gotten a far superior joint off of the table saw and almost no effort. Although it wasn't perfect, I was able to get a pretty decent joint off of the miter saw, and after I did that, to give the table the best chance to not blow these seams apart, I went ahead and dominoed everything once again. So quite a few more dominoes went in here, and I had to keep track of the sizing for those holes, as I still needed to allow for expansion and contraction in different ways because of all of the different joints and wood direction. To close up some of the miters, I glued on the offcuts, and this is a trick that I've seen on several different videos that I've watched, and it worked okay. The biggest thing is that the green tape I was using just didn't hold enough, and so I ended up pulling all of them off. Once again, I had to be careful not to put any wood glue where it would be visible, and because of all of the different angles, pulling it all together with the clamps was a little bit harder than I first anticipated. Overall, it went pretty well. The biggest thing is that it took a lot of back and forth, tightening clamps up just a little bit at a time. It was right about now when I took a 2-month break from working on this top, and there were several reasons for that, but by far the largest reason was that me and my family moved. And so getting the shop set up to be able to continue working on this took about 2 months. But in the meantime, I also had a couple small projects that delayed this. But since this one is a personal project, I'm kind of putting it on the back burner so that I can work on things that are going to pay. Now, I'm really excited about this new shop as it's just a little bit bigger, but also we were able to paint before we moved in, and I felt like that made it a lot more professional looking, and the lighting reflects a little bit more. After getting everything set up how I wanted it, I was able to begin working on the top again, and the top at this point is really close. All I really wanted to do was sand it and put an edge profile on it. So for this edge profile, I just did an 1/8 inch round over on the top and a 15-degree bevel on the bottom. And when I'm doing an edge profile, I always make sure to do it one step before I hit 180 grit, or my final grit sanding, which generally is 180. After that, I do a water pop to raise the grain and do the final sanding, and then I get to do my favorite step, which is finishing. And for this finish, I'm going to do it a little bit different than I did the slats and the live edge, because I was able to afford some nicer finish. And this is a finish I haven't tried yet, but I've really wanted to for a while, and it's called Sample 73. It's by Four Eyes Furniture, and just to spoil it, I love it. It's fantastic. Highly, highly recommend it. It is extremely similar to Rubio Monaco. In fact, I couldn't tell you what's different except for the bottle. The bottle is what really sells me on it. I used to love Rubio Monaco until I ran out of the first bottle, and really I only ran out of the accelerator portion, and that just made me really mad, honestly, that they would sell it with such a difference. Now you can use it without the accelerator, and so I kind of see a point there, but it just felt kind of useless. And that's why I liked Sample 73, is because the bottles are designed so that you can use 100% of the finish. Now that I have that rant out of my system, I can move on to using one of my new toys, and that is a standalone jointer from Grizzly. Now this is still a 6-inch jointer. The biggest difference is that it's got more power, for one, and a longer in and out feed. And that really does make a large difference when you're trying to flatten boards. From what I've been told, you can flatten boards about twice the length of your in and out feed tables. So if you have a 24-inch in and out feed, then you can joint up to a 48-inch. Now some people say it's more about how you use it, but in this instance, I really think that length does matter. Once I have one face and one edge jointed, I can go over and rip them down to their final width. And since these are all going to be making a shelf, I want them to be a consistent width. So I pre-planned for that, grabbing boards that were all about 5 inches wide, so that by the time I could dimension them, they would be 4.5 inches wide, bringing the grand total to 22.5 inches wide. Now, if you're going to do something like this, I highly recommend that you do it while you're in the lumber yard, so that you have the least amount of waste. While doing the glue up, I used some cauls that I purposefully put a bow into it, so that it would put more pressure in the center, and as you squeeze it, that pressure would be pushed out along the whole length, essentially making this glue up come together pretty flat. One issue I ran into was that my clamps just weren't big enough, and so I had to kind of force it in a couple instances. So in the future, I'll cut off an inch or two on each of these, and that should make it work a lot better. If you want to use cauls like this, I highly recommend using some form of tape, whether that's Tyvek tape, tuck tape, or packing tape. They all do the same job pretty well at making the glue not stick. Once I got through gluing up all of the shelf parts, I moved on to milling the 6/4 walnut for the legs. I used a bandsaw to get the rough size and then a tapering jig on my table saw to cut it down to the final width. And this is something that I haven't done a lot of with tapering or really jigs for the table saw, but I've been watching a lot of videos by Four Eyes Furniture, and in that Chris uses a lot of different jigs for his table saw. I feel like that was the best approach for both the tapered part of the leg and the offshoot for what will eventually be a Y-shaped leg. For that little arm that was going to come off, what I did was I took the template that I cut on my laser and I just traced that on this sled, so that with each of the parts that I had pre-milled on the bandsaw, I could just place on there and know that I had them in right about the right spot, and then I could reference off of that perfect face for the actual template. Once I had both parts lined up with where they needed to be on the template, I was able to mark out for a couple of dominoes. And once again, you don't need to use dominoes. Biscuits or dowels work just as good, but because this is an end grain to long grain glue up, I really wanted the additional strength that dominoes will provide. And I apologize for the really awful view right here. I was trying to rush and get this step done so that they could cure overnight. As for my glue ups, recently I have been trying out using Type Bond Dark, and I have been pretty surprised at how much I've liked it. I found that even if I don't do the perfect job at clamping it and making sure the joints are perfect, that they come together and the glue really just hides that joint really well. As far as clamping went for this, I just threw it in a single parallel clamp, and generally you have to essentially tape on a caul or something to make this joint come together, but the angles worked out pretty much perfect. That just the single clamp with 2 C-clamps to keep everything else aligned worked out perfect. And I wasn't too worried about smushing the end grain of the arm on that Y, because I was going to come in with a router and the table saw to take some of that off. The next day I came in, took the clamps off, and then I cleaned up all of the glue squeeze out with a chisel and sent everything through the planer just to make sure that everything was pretty smooth. It would make sanding a little bit easier, and also routing would have a lot better smooth surface for the router to run along. For the arm coming off of the Y, to get it to the appropriate size, I was just going to use the template I cut out. So I threw in a template bit into my palm router and went to town. Now, to be honest, I don't really remember why I did the end grain, because I was already planning on coming back with the table saw and cutting that and making it flush, so I would have preferred to have that little bit of extra space, but in the long run it didn't really change anything. Because the leg was too thick for my router to do it in a single pass, I just took the template off for the second pass, and that was able to cut all the way through. Before I did the roundovers on the edges, I wanted to come in and fill some of the cracks with some epoxy, and mostly that was because I didn't know if those cracks would go into the edge, and if they did, that'd be a really odd place to try and do some epoxy. But as of right now, since they're square, it would be fairly easy. And so with the hot glue gun, I went ahead and made some dams so that as the epoxy shrunk, it would be able to pull from those dams rather than going under the top of the surface. I've had that happen a couple times, and so these dams just really make it so I don't have to come back and do epoxy twice. Since I just used some tabletop epoxy the following day, I was able to come in and do those roundovers. And for that, once again, I used my little palm router, clamped down half of the leg, and then after I got the first half done, just moved the clamp. That way I was able to be pretty safe without having the leg tip on me. The first time I tried it, I was just trying to hold it in place, and that just didn't go very well. After doing the round over, I went ahead and sanded up to 150 grit, and then I did the water pop. And I absolutely love doing the water pop because you get to see all of the beautiful grain finally come to life. Especially with walnut, there's just something so satisfying about this. After doing the water pop and while I was letting it dry, I went ahead and threw one of the offcuts from the laser jig onto my crosscut sled. And this would allow me to cut all of these down to length exactly the same. And it really worked super well. I was pretty surprised, honestly. After that, I decided that this table needed some leveling legs, so I went ahead and drilled those out. Sadly, I don't have a drill press or anything to make it so that these are like a perfect 90, but to be honest, I don't think that you really need those. It goes in pretty straight either way, and even if it is off just a hair, nobody's gonna know. For my leveling legs, I just use furniture bolts, honestly, and then I glue on some felt so that they will be non-marring on any like hardwood flooring or anything like that. I always like to cut those in before I do finish as well, just because I don't want that to be a weak spot where moisture can get in. And once I got through 180 grit sanding, I went ahead and put on some Tung oil. And really the biggest reason I went with the Tung oil versus Sample 73 was budget. The Sample 73 is a far superior product, but it also costs a lot more, and so I really only wanted to use it on the top because I knew the top needed more protection than the legs. And I think the legs turned out really beautiful. I really love the amount of sheen I was able to get from the Tung oil with just 2 coats, sanding between coats. While the first coat cured, I moved back to working on the shelf, and to start off I just cut off a couple inches on the length, and this is something I already knew I wanted to take care of. I was just trying to cut off the snipe from the jointer. And after that, I went ahead and sanded everything. The cauls did a pretty good job at keeping everything flat, but there was a little bit of, I'll call it weaving, where a board would go up and down a little bit. And it wasn't too bad to take care of. I used a hand plane to get rid of most of it and then cleaned it up with the sander. I forgot to record the hand plane stuff, and obviously you don't want to watch me sanding for a couple hours, so I saved you that hassle. After that, I moved on to cutting the dados in the legs, and the biggest reason I didn't cut these earlier was because I needed to know the final thickness of the shelf. And I don't have a proper dado stack, and so essentially I just moved the blade over about a 1/16 inch at a time and snuck up on that perfect fit. After that, I moved on to doing the second coat of finish, and this is where I kind of messed things up. The Tung oil is a good finish, but you have to be really cautious to remove any excess. If you don't remove it, then you will end up with kind of tacky spots. They will cure eventually, but I had a couple of those that they're a little bit shinier right there. After debating for a while on how I wanted to attach the legs to the coffee top, I realized that I had been overthinking it and that these figure 8 fasteners that I'd seen on several other YouTube channels would be the perfect solution to be pretty simple to do, but also be able to attach something kind of uniquely shaped. With those cut in with the router, I was able to move on to attaching the legs to the shelf. And to be honest, I'm a little bit embarrassed to even show this part because I knew better in the moment, but I still did it. I put wood glue on a surface that was already finished, and I knew it wasn't going to stick, and I haven't fixed it as of yet, but it bugs me a little bit that I didn't take the 15 minutes to do this the right way. I was just too excited and wanted to have it done right then. As of right now, it is still holding together, and it's been about a week and a half up in our living room, being kind of beaten up by our son. And I've been pleasantly surprised at how well it's done, but I can also hear it creaking every now and then, and I know that one of the biggest reasons it's doing that is because of me skipping doing this the proper way and gluing to a pre-finished surface. To attach the legs to the coffee top, I've already talked about how I was going to use these figure 8 tops. Now I cut out a template and routed out a little area for these to sit so that they could be flush. And then I just went ahead and screwed all of them in, used some double-sided sticky tape, put that on each fastener where the leg would sit so that I could unscrew those once I have it in the proper placement, and the fasteners will stick to the legs when I flip it over so that I could screw the holes going into the legs and everything would line up when I screw it all back together. And jumping back to my question on how many dominoes you guys think this had, if you haven't guessed yet, make sure to pause and go into the comments and give me your guess. But this table took 110 dominoes. Now, I'll be the first to admit that that is a boatload of dominoes, but I think that every one of them was well worth it. The table ended up coming together better than I ever imagined, and I am just super ecstatic with it. Now, on the other hand, my wife is not so ecstatic about it. She does not like contrasting grains, and so she just threw a blanket on me. She didn't love the white cottonwood with the black walnut look. But I would love to hear what you guys think of this table. And if for some reason you are interested in it, it is for sale on my website, splitwoodstudio.com. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated on future builds. And if you liked this one, you can also check out one of these other videos.